Oh, there we are. Okay, you can figure that out. Oh, okay. Okay. What is that for this? Okay, thanks everyone for being here today. It's been good meeting with you all. And I'm excited to share my job market paper. The effect of state level rate bill abolition laws on school attendance in the 19th century US. Just to give a brief overview, around this time, public primary school enrollment is vastly increasing across the United States. So it goes from about 55% to almost 90% over this period from 1830 through 1900. My job market paper is going to look at one potential policy shift that may have affected this dramatic increase, and that's the abolition of rate bills, which is kind of the catch-all term for tuition and other fees for public schools, which had previously been heavily subsidized, but not entirely free to users. These policies were effectively imposed on rural areas by state legislatures and or referenda. And that it's from this third bullet point that I'm really going to draw my exogeny in this project. Basically, I answered the question, how did rate bill abolition affect education in the United States? So remember, we're taking these public schools and we're saying in the pre-abolition regime, public schools are provided by the government, by the local school district, and they're subsidized but not entirely free. So I'm going to exploit the staggered adoption of these state level policies to ban tuition in these public schools, using full count decennial census data from 1850 through 1880 and abolition dates from 27 states. A brief preview of the results is that I'm going to see large statistically significant increases in attendance in rural areas and a null effect in urban areas. Remember that these policies are going to be imposed on rural areas, and urban areas in most cases will have already adopted free public schooling prior to this time. So urban areas are going to be an effective placebo test in this project. Unsurprisingly, these results are going to be stronger for low socioeconomic status individuals. So these are probably the people that we would think as being most inhibited by even small fees for public schools. And we're still going to see large effects even when individuals are observed at ages 10 and above. This is important because for these individuals, this is where the opportunity cost of working is slightly larger. This is kind of right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, so that's something to keep in mind. This is compulsory schooling law, pre-child labor law. So the fact that even individuals 10 and above are still attending is important. And this also is important in setting the foundation for the high school revolution, which is something I'll talk about very, very shortly. Question?
I guess two questions that maybe you'll get to when you talk more about these rate bills. I guess the first is that the changing in the financing of public schools, particularly in the rural areas, change control over resource allocation in the schools based on whether it was sort of funded via this rate bill fee versus tax dollars. And then second, my understanding, right, is that the rate bill is sort of a flat tax across all households. Is that right? And who? I guess I want to get an idea of who's paying the rate fee versus when public schools are financed via the tax. Is it essentially a redistribution kind of effect of the change?
So that's a good question. I'll try to answer both at once. So when school districts themselves, I'm going to go over this in a bit, but when school districts themselves are the ones that are providing the schools for free, they're typically funding schools through local taxes. So in that case, it's like property taxes, which is exactly where you see this redistribution. But when the rate bills are replaced, because these are state level policies, they're typically actually replaced by state funding. So in that sense, we're not seeing the same kind of redistribution, or we might not expect it. It's still coming from a larger tax base, but it's not driven. It's not redistributed.
And does control over how the funding is spent by sort of local schools changing with this mechanism of financing? Is there less control when the state is funding it versus when
Yeah.
It's funded through the fee, or is it the same source?
My initial response would be to say no change. I would say that I haven't seen any evidence that something like that is changing, across this time. In fact, part of what what made American schools, unique at this time, according to Golden Cat, some papers that I'll come back to later, is that a lot of the control was at the local level. These local school districts, rather than having like large policies, really drives a lot of the American education system. So you have another
Yeah,
question?
this reminds me of a paper that first presented at the Stanford Berkeley historical seminars back in the 1980s. And they were explaining gender differentials in mortality of boys and girls age 10
Okay,
over the United States, and they found that basically there was excess female mortality, and little girls in that period were more likely to die before they reached age 10, and that this was explained by the need for boys in agriculture. Parents want, just like now in India and Pakistan and other places like that, they prefer to have boys. In those days, they preferred to have boys also, and they would give the boys better nutrition to let them, work in the farms. So I'm sure that the regional differences were very much a function of the role of agriculture in the state.
yeah, so that is in some sense exactly the one population that I'm going to think is especially relevant for farmers. I'm going to talk a lot more about this when I talk about the low socioeconomic status group. In terms of, I know this isn't quite what you were asking, but in terms of gender differences, I'm going to pull everybody. Attendance rates are very similar across genders. We're going to see that in just a couple of slides. Initially I broke them up, and it doesn't matter. Gender differences in terms of education, but mortality, I agree would be a different story. So I'm going to contribute to a few different topics. Specifically, I'll contribute to these the importance of zero price as eliminating barriers to education. When I talk about some of the related literature, they in some senses don't make use of this slight difference between zero and some epsilon price. And I find that it's really just getting to zero that's a big goal. Also, the importance of pecuniary versus opportunity costs. This is especially relevant to today when we think about community college in the United States. But these pecuniary costs in terms of rate bills are very small. Like the high estimate that I use is 2.5% of average income for a farmer. Whereas the opportunity cost for a child working on the farm might be way larger than that. In community college, the average pecuniary cost, I think, is somewhere in the range of $3,000 to $4,000, whereas the average wage for a high school graduate is close to $40,000. So these relative the differences between pecuniary and opportunity costs are very important. And then, in addition, in a lot of the developing world, public primary schools still aren't great, and attendance rates, enrollment rates are well below what the U.S. had even 120 years ago. So thinking about tuition and other fees as a barrier to education is important. Yes.
So it seems like you're thinking about this in terms of demand for education from the parents or the children's perspective. Was there any school building going on, and is it just that the supply of schools increased kind of at the same time as these fees were getting eliminated?
So I don't observe, schools being built. There is a lot of evidence in these state constitutions about how much schools they had to provide, and that's not changing over this time. So yeah, I do think about this as very different insight. Additionally, and I'm going to talk about this later with the assumptions, if there was some other policy going on, we might see some effect in urban areas in addition, and we're not going to see that. So if there is school building going on in rural and urban areas, then we would see an increase in urban The fact that it's only happening in rural areas, I agree that it's possible that there's only school building going on in some sectors,
Well,
but
I would say like transportation in an urban area to get from to a school is gonna matter less than in a rural area.
yeah, from the state constitutions that I've read or the charters from their territories before they were states, a lot of the school construction was mandated by, some geographic region, by some number of families and population. Additionally, I'm going to contribute to the literature on the development of the US education system. So, I mentioned earlier that there's this huge explosion during this time. And in 1890, the primary school enrollment rate is 97.1%. So this is higher than the figure before because the data for public schools is a little bit more restrictive. So it's about 90% in public schools by 1910, but already we're seeing near universal primary education in 1890. And this really sheds light on the relative contributions of free public schools and compulsory schooling, something that I'm going to kind of contrast to later in my talk. And just to give you the result now, I really come out on the side that these free public schools are a major driver of educational attainment, much more so than early compulsory schooling laws in the second half of the 19th century. Then there's also this high school revolution that I mentioned, documented very well by Claudia Golden from 1910 to 1940. Here's an explosion in secondary school enrollment rates, high school graduation rates. This all follows the standardization of the American high school, which actually, I learned this reading one of the papers. There was no standard. The first, I think, high school diploma was awarded in 1902, somewhere in the Midwest. And the authors in their book really reference this mass primary schooling as instrumental to setting the stage for this high school revolution. So mass secondary schooling in the early 20th century was made possible by universal elementary education, already spreading through most sections of education. So these rate bills, the elimination of these rate bills and tuition really does help to set the stage for this high school revolution by encouraging this mass primary school. A little bit of background. Rate bills, as I mentioned, is kind of the catch-all term for tuition and other fees. Things just weren't, necessarily called the same in all these different areas, and this is kind of what the literature has decided to name these charters. Rate bills were very small. As I mentioned earlier, the high estimates put it at about 2.5%. So that's very small, and that's using areas in the American South where rate bills were larger and wages were also smaller. And zeroing in specifically on the farming population. So even for this these groups that might be most exposed, most inhibited by rate bills, we're still talking about only 2.5% of it. As I mentioned, a lot of municipalities did, prior to these state level policies, provide free schools. And this is primarily funded by local taxes, so property taxes, something you might see redistribution upon or through. And then when states abolished these rate bills for public schools, they replaced them with that revenue through state funding. So this isn't saying you can't charge tuition anymore, but the quality of your schools are going to be decreased because you now lost funding. The idea is that they're still receiving that funding, but it can't come from the families of those students. A little bit of the literature for rate bills. This is a pretty underexplored topic, in my opinion. This book by Elwood Coverley from 1919, so a bit over 100 years ago, examines the case in New York, where prior to 1826, schools had been provided for free by a nonprofit, and then they impose a rate bill because their costs are going up. They want to provide schools for more children, so they're going to increase, or they're going to start charging tuition. And he finds that attendance drops by about 10%. This is there are larger decreases for those more advanced courses that were associated with higher tuition. And in fact, this attendance drop was so dramatic that in 1831 they repealed the rate bill. They went back to free schools because these rate bills were inhibiting attendance in their community. Most other cities in New York State, which was one of the leaders, abolished rate bills in the 1840s and 1850s. And then the state finally imposes it on the rural areas in 1860, the late 1860s. The second paper is by Sun Go from 2015, where he uses Rhode Island counties and finds that those with higher initial rate bills saw larger attendance gains when schools became free. So this kind of implies that those that people were more inhibited when the costs were higher, as one might expect. As I mentioned, what my paper is going to build on this with is looking specifically at that zero price, because I think these charges are very small. So looking at the difference between zero and some small price is going to be important.
Sorry, so when these rate bills get abolished, is there any change to the tax rate that's going on in states, or what is it coming out of in terms of the revenue? You talk about this as abolishing the rate bill makes the price zero, and I'm just trying to understand how the shift in financing is, potentially affecting the prices of other things, or the availability of resources for other things.
So I don't have good information on where exactly this money might be coming out of, but I do want to reemphasize that these charges are very small. So they're already in the large case subsidizing these public schools, and it's only changing this little bit at the margin that these rate bill abolition laws are impacting. So hopefully that gets at that one. Yeah, question.
Sorry, we're not letting you get very far. I'm interested in the politics of this too, especially in the deep south. How are Black children affected by this? They have separate schools, and they were also charging these fees, and then were not afterward. I'm trying to picture whether the existence of higher than average fees in the deep south was deliberate to try to limit who could attend.
So yeah, that's a great point to bring up. I am going to I'll bring up 2 points. First, in a lot of the southern states, these rate bill abolition policies are in some sense imposed on those states as a condition for readmission into the United States. So
This is good information.
yeah, so it's in a lot of the constitutions that they had to adopt when they were being readmitted. They had to set aside certain provisions.
The Reconstruction era policy, I wonder if it got unwound. It didn't unwind in the 1890s and early.
So I can't answer that, and I'm only looking through 1880. So in a lot of senses that shouldn't really impact my results. The second thing is I'm only going to look at white native born American students. One reason is as the Civil War happens, as slavery ends in the United States, it'd be pretty unfair to look at this time period and see attendance go up for minorities and say it's rate bill abolition. It could very well be the abolition of slavery. The second reason, this is more practical, is that African Americans are not included in the census prior to, or I'm sorry, enslaved African Americans are not included in the census at this time. I was watching a talk a couple weeks ago, and somebody said, yeah, in 1873 million Black people just appear out of nowhere, but it's because they were counted in a separate census. So African Americans. I'm just going to focus specifically on white people. Yeah. Really quick, I do want to just touch on compulsory schooling laws. I'm sure some of you were thinking about this as I got started with the talk. First, I want to mention this paper by Lenz and Solman, which looks at the impact of these early compulsory schooling laws, which are typically adopted in the 1870s for many states. And it finds that these CSLs basically do not affect enrollment or attendance or any number of educational indicators, like a days attended per student, things like that. This is probably because these policies were often unenforced, especially in rural areas, and they're not typically binding. So if you say in 1875 that everyone has to go to school at least until they're 8 years old, and everybody's already going to school until they're 10 years old, then you wouldn't really expect to see much of a change based on the CSLs. Second, there's a marginal positive effect of compulsory schooling laws in the 20th century. And a whole bunch of papers have used these compulsory schooling laws as an instrument to look at other outcomes that we might think would be associated with education. So Meridian and Walker look at crime, Yarra's Muni looks at mortality, I believe, and Sandy Black et al. Look at fertility. So these are all things that education impacts. And then, sorry, did you have a question? Oh no. But in a lot of these cases, they're finding marginal positive effects. I believe it is Sandy Black points out that when you cluster at the correct level, the significance of these effects will as well. Real quick, before I delve into the data and start talking about the decennial census, I do want to pause and see if there are any more questions. Yes.
I have a question. So you kind of alluded to the opportunity cost of education here. Saying you're kind of pitting opportunity costs with pecuniary costs. You mentioned an industrial revolution. So should we be thinking about like the opportunity cost here as being, you know, my child could go and work in a factory, or is this that my child could be working out in the fields, or what, like what's kind of the source of the opportunity cost? And I think my follow-up question then would be, there could be potentially interesting variation what that opportunity cost is over this time period, which could also maybe interact in interesting ways with the reduction in the pecuniary costs. Does the reduction in the pecuniary cost make people, not only does it get people to go to school, but does it make them less sensitive to changes in opportunity cost, which I think could be potentially interesting.
Excuse me. Yeah, that is something that I would need to think a little bit more about. Yeah.
If you remove this, you become less sensitive to this.
Yeah, I would need to think a little bit more about that. Yeah, question?
Yeah, maybe just for some background, do you have any sense, just sort of demographically, what proportion of young kids were migrating to urban areas for economic opportunity? And then at this, I guess at the same time, what proportion of kids in urban areas were immigrants? I know you're not including them, but I'm just wondering, all these things are happening at the same time.
Yeah, so in terms of migrating to the United States, I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what fraction of the children that I observed in my larger data set are coming from that group. But it's not a majority by any stretch. It's probably, I wouldn't want to speculate.
Okay.
But it's not a large fraction. As for kind of within the US migration, the first point you brought up, I am unable to observe people who moved within the same state. But one of my robustness checks is I drop everybody who is being educated in a state that's different from that which they're born. So I don't get to see your whole location path, but I do get to see where you're born and where you currently are. And if that's different, I can drop those individuals and the results don't change. It's actually about 15% of the observations, which I thought was very high. Looking at children who are between the ages of 5 and 14, and 15% of those are in states different from where they were born. I think part of that might be driven by the Civil War and that massive upheaval. But that's a different question. Yeah, but yeah, it's a good point that I can't observe people from rural areas. Were there any other questions before I dive into the data? No? Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use these racial abolition dates from Sun Go 2015. I'll show you a table in just a couple minutes. And I get 1850 through 1880 full count decennial census data from iPhones. So this will have the whole group of individuals. I see everyone in their household. And it's 100% sample, like I said. So we're gonna have millions and millions of observations. I'm going to restrict my sample to white native born people, like I mentioned before. I'll only look at the ages of 5 to 14, so that main group of people that we think would be attending primary school. I'm going to focus on rural areas, again, those places that were charging rate bills up until these policies stopped them from doing so. And I'm going to focus on the 27 states for which I know when they abolished these rate bills. So here's the table of dates where we get the state, the year that they abolished their rate bills, and the year, if I have it as a subset of the year that they implement compulsory schooling laws. So just because somebody mentioned it earlier, thinking of the South, if you look in this post-war period, it's a lot of the former Confederacy that we see here: Virginia, Georgia, Florida, Arkansas, South Carolina, all in this, antebellum period or post-war period.
I'm surprised that Louisiana is so different from the other southern states. Does that have anything to do with the French colonization?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. That's a. Yeah, that's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that.
Were there any sort of, this was specific, I know the rural urban helps sort of a little bit about this, but were there any industry specific child labor laws that
No, this really predates a lot of child labor laws. I do check in my data. I think I have this in a footnote of the paper. I am able to look. It's pretty incomplete, but the census did ask if you were working even to children, and a very small fraction of children said they were working at this time. So anyways, to get back to this, the first two states I have highlighted, Louisiana and Wisconsin. These are the first states which I'm going to observe different people in the 1850 census who are untreated or partially treated. Everybody from Pennsylvania and before will have already been treated by 1850, which is the first census for which you get individual level data. So in Louisiana and Wisconsin, some people will be fully treated based on their age, but some people will be partially treated because they will have started school even prior to these policies coming into effect. Next, I want to highlight New York, which I mentioned had this very stark rural urban split. Ellen probably very clearly describes the situation of all these cities that are abolishing rate bills or providing public schools for free, and how in rural areas they were fighting to continue to charge tuition. There's a map that I'll click on in the appendix later. So it's up to you. And then third, I want to highlight Vermont. Vermont is the first state here to implement the compulsory schooling law, actually very soon after their rate bill abolition. So this is the only state that implemented CSL prior to 1870. So one of my robustness checks is when I try to control for compulsory schooling laws. One way I can do that is by dropping Vermont, and instead of going all the way through 1880, going up through 1870. And at that point, there are no states that have implemented CSL. So any effect that I observe should hopefully be driven just by rate bill abolition. This is a map of all the states included, where the shade indicates the decade in which they adopted these policies. So all of these states that are blank are unfortunately blank. It'd be great to get more states, but the 27 states from Suncoast paper really are the leaders. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if this is also overlapping with this period of mass migration, the largest in the United States. So I was wondering what share of the kids in those public schools were basically native born, like you have in your sample stated.
Yeah, I think this goes back to something from earlier. I don't know off the top of my head, but in any case, presumably that should be a lot of people are migrating, I think, to urban areas. That's
So they would be following your.
so they'd be showing up in a
Exactly.
placebo test rather than in the
Exactly.
mean
It's gonna be
specification.
disproportionately following.
Yeah. So yeah, I that'd be a good thing for me to check what fraction of individuals are coming from abroad, or at least were born abroad.
Yes, they have had an idea.
Yeah, if I can remember, I don't think that it changes too much.
Yeah, it's just, the focus on wine and native born and.
Yeah, it's, I don't know if it's quite ironic, but it's too bad that I am, in some sense, focusing in on the population that we might think would be least inhibited by these charters, right? We think that African Americans who are duty free might be especially sensitive to these small rate bills. We might think that immigrants who only just in this country might be especially inhibited by rate bills. But for identification purposes, I have to focus on those. Okay, so if there are no questions on the map, I'll go ahead and plot the attendance. So here we have the school attendance rates by age in 1850. So the y-axis is your probability of saying that you attended school in the past year in the census. And on the x-axis, we have the age at which that individual is observed. So around 5 children are starting primary school, and their attendance peaks in kind of that 9, 10, 11 range, and then falling off. As I think I mentioned this, we're not going to see male-female differences in attendance rates, or if we restrict the sample and run the regression separately. So rural men, rural women very closely track each other, and urban men, urban women very closely track each other. Yes.
Curious if you have any measures in a census or anything to be used as a proxy for school quality. I don't know if this is, I mean, literacy rates, might be too crude. But just given some of the concerns around kind of the financing and substitution, I know you said that it's a relatively small amount, so it's probably not, you're not removing these bills and these schools are getting decimated, but you'd maybe, if you had something about, likelihood of being literate conditional on attending school or something like that to see if that at all changes, you could speak to potentially that dimension.
Yeah, so when I was first getting started with this, I was kind of thinking about some educational attainment outcome, and literacy was one of the first ones because that is reported at this time, whereas educational attainment itself is not.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, literacy is already very high at this
Okay.
time,
So you don't have a
be
lot
able to see looking at this population. Yeah, go ahead.
Starting at age 12 and 13, I see a big gender differential for rural men and women. The blue and the red lines.
Yeah, that's true. I don't have any great data on why this might be happening. It could be something about fertility patterns at this time. I know that's a lot earlier than we would expect fertility today. Yeah, I don't have too much to say. In any case, individuals that are above the age of 14 aren't going to be included. This is more just descriptive for what's happening, what attendance is looking like at this time. You have a question?
Sorry, it's a little counterintuitive that people would be leaving school earlier in urban areas. Do you have an explanation for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this kind of gets at the structure of the census question. When they say it's formatted, have you attended school at any time in the past? Which, so some people.
Seasonal, and so you can do your work and still.
Exactly, there's presumably a lot of part-time attendance going on here. Some people already know the comes from. Yeah, and that's something I'm going to touch on a little bit later when I try to use a back of the envelope calculation to translate this attendance into actual educational attainment. Yeah, so these people aren't going to show up in the data anyways, but if they are attending, it's probably part-time. Okay. Next, I'll touch on my empirical strategy. I'm actually going to jump ahead real quick, just to briefly show the equation that I'll eventually estimate, where I'm going to have this outcome y, which is your probability of attending, or whether or not you show up as attending in the census, which is equal to a constant plus a beta for treatment, or beta times treatment, beta 2 for partial treatment, which I'll touch on these in just a second. And then I'm going to have state by age fixed effects. So this is going to control for kind of the attendance profiles in each state, right? So the attendance figure I showed earlier is the aggregate for the country, but there are big differences in how people are attending when we look at the age profiles. Then I'm going to have an age by year fixed effect. This is a cohort fixed effect, right? Because I'm only looking at people between the ages of 5 and 14, nobody's going to, that age gap is less than 10 years, so everyone only shows up in one census. So this is going to be a cohort fixed effect, basically. Then we're gonna have an error term, which is clustered at the state level. Okay. I'm gonna make 3 big assumptions for this. Oh, yeah,
I
question.
have a question about the equation of the child.
Yeah.
You're essentially defining treatment by the age of the child, but the way I think about this is it's a household income shock. So if I have a younger sibling or an older sibling, I'm gonna be affected whether or not I'm in the age range that you're using. So
Okay.
suppose I'm 6 years old and I have 3 siblings, every one of them is now benefiting from this rate abolition. My treatment effect is gonna be greater than if I have no siblings.
Okay, yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's a great point. The best I can say to that is, I don't have it in the presentation, but I can do a heterogeneity analysis based on the household size. I do find that the effects are stronger for bigger houses. So I
So
can
do
do,
you see multiple children from the same household? So you could be incorporating that some way.
yeah, whether I included it on the right-hand side of the treatment that'd be another way to get at that heterogeneity. That's not, I've only included it by kind of looking at these different populations by household size, but including it in the treatment would be really interesting, yeah. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's a really good thing to think about. So anyways, to get to these assumptions, there are 3 big assumptions that I want to make when I'm trying to achieve identification. These first 2 are going to actually attenuate my my coefficient towards 0 if anything, but I think they're still important to talk about. First, rate bills are going to be used in rural areas up until abolition. So there's very it's somewhat well known, depending on the state, when urban areas are providing schools for free, it is much less well understood what is happening in rural areas. So I have to assume that this is happening everywhere. If it is the case that some places in upstate New York are actually providing schools for free, even prior to these state level policies, that's going to attenuate me towards 0, because those people should be considered controlled, but I'm actually including them in the treatment group. Second, individuals above the age of 10 are unaffected by this. So as we saw from the attendance profiles I showed earlier, attendance really starts declining at around 10 or 11. And so one might think that if I am 10 years old and I drop out of school, and then when I'm 12, these policies come into effect, it's not necessarily reasonable to think that I'm going to then start going back to school. Like once you kind of exit primary school, you might not be affected by any of these policies. Yes, question.
I guess that's a question, right? So do we have any information on rural areas, whether kids are coming in and out sporadically, part-time, then taking off I mean, it might just be worthwhile to like get a little descriptive evidence on that point.
Yeah, it's definitely not in these data would I be able to say anything like that, just because I'm only observing everybody once, because of the disseminal nature. Excuse me. But that is something to think about. And again, this is going to cause attenuation back towards 0. Because if I am 11 or 12 years old and I actually am induced to continue schooling by these policies, then by including these individuals in the control, I'm going to be biasing myself that way again. And then third, and this is the most important threat to me here, is that these rate bill abolition laws are not passed in conjunction with some other education promoting policy. Because if it is the case that schools are now free, but then also we build a bunch more schools then it's tough to say if the increase in attendance is driven by the prices or driven by the availability. What I'm gonna do for that is I'm going to use urban areas as a placebo test. Excuse me, because a lot of these areas had typically provided schools for free even prior to these policies, and I'm going to find absolutely no effect. It's just staggering how close to zero this data is going to be. Now I want to touch on the treatment. I know I've already shown the equation, but I'm going to consider an individual fully treated if they are 6 or younger when these policies come into effect. So this is somebody whose entire educational career is going to be in this post-rate bill free school regime. Next, I'm going to have this partially treated group, those individuals that had started school, but were probably still attending at the time that these policies were passed, and that's going to be 7 to 10 inclusive. And then, as a technical note, individuals are only treated after the policies are passed. So there are some states, for example, that passed laws in 1871. So if I'm 5 in 1870, then that person would have been treated by this because they were 6 when the policies come into effect, but those policies had not yet started. That's just a small technical note. It affects very few observations. And then, so I'll give this example of Connecticut, which passes a rate bill abolition law in 1868. So everybody in 1850 and 1860 is going to be untreated in that state. And then in 1870, 2 cohorts, 1856 and 1857, are also going to be untreated because those individuals were 10 and 11. No, I'm sorry, 11 and 12 when this policy came into effect. Then this group of cohorts from 1858 to 1861 are going to be partially treated, and everybody 1862 and later is going to be treated in both 1870 and 1880 when I observe the next row. I'll also mention briefly, because all the individuals are untreated before these policies and fully treated some years after the policies, depending on when these policies come into effect and when exactly the census occurs. A large fraction, like 90, I think it's around 92% of the population here, is going to be in either the fully treated or the untreated bits. So the exact definition of partial treatment, whether it's 7 to 10 or 6 to 11, that's not really going to change anything because almost everybody is either fully treated or fully untreated. So that's just important to note. That it's not sensitive to the definition here of partial treatment at all. A little bit about exogeneity. As I mentioned earlier, these policies are basically imposed on rural areas. I'm going to show this map in just a second. And we should note that all municipalities that are continuing to charge tuition and other fees at this time could have provided public school for free, just like these urban municipalities were doing prior to these policies. Of course, they would have had to fund it through local taxes or something instead of the state funding. But these really are the places that are explicitly choosing not to have free schools prior to the state level policies. I want to show this map of New York, which is really going to highlight the rural urban divide. So all of the white, the unshaded regions are the counties in New York that are for free schools. So these are a lot of the urban counties, you see New York, Brooklyn, Queens, and along the railroad, we have a lot of these cities, some of which you get Syracuse up there, Albany, Buffalo, Rochester. A lot of these cities are voting for free schools, basically trying to impose it on the entire state. And then all these rural counties are against free schools. Actually, Rochester, this map is from 1850. Rochester did end up abolishing their rate of writing schools for free prior to these state level policies. So even these urban areas that are on the fringe are still against free schools in 1850 are still coming in before the state level policies in 1860, in the late 1860s. So
So they were, just to be clear, the urban areas were also funded by local taxes, by localized taxes when they were sort of when they were abolishing their rate bills prior to the state law, is that right?
Yeah, that's gonna be the primary funding mechanism. New York City is strange that it was a nonprofit, it was the Free School Society of New York, but I think in general, it's going to be a lot of local taxation, especially property tax, I didn't mention that earlier. So here's my specification again, I'll pause for questions if anybody has something that's come up in the assumptions and the exogenating treatment categories. No? Okay, then I'll talk briefly about clustering. I'm going to cluster my area, my standard areas or my areas at the state level. You know, this follows the literature that if treatment is assigned at the state level, then kind of be clustered at that level. Remember that I have at most 27 states included in my primary specification. I'm going to run robustness excluding the South, again, because the Civil War is happening right in the middle of this period. When I consider compulsory schooling laws, because there's data on a lot fewer of those, I'm only going to be able to use 15. So this is the full number of clusters. If we were to look at the effective number of clusters, it would be even lower. And for that reason, we use the G-1 degrees of freedom in T distribution, and then the wild bootstrap because we don't have enough clusters in this point. And this is in most cases inference is going to be unaffected. Everything that's statistically significant using conventional methods will also be statistically significant using the wild bootstrap. So now I'll talk about my findings. So here I have the full treatment and the partial treatment for both rural and urban areas. As I mentioned, we see this large effect in rural areas, about 7.2 percentage points, which is statistically significant in general and using the wild bootstrap. We can contrast that to the urban areas where we see absolutely no effect. And then if we focus in on individuals that I observe when they're 10 years old, I'm still assigning treatment based on how old you were, like in the same way, how old you are when these policies come into effect. But I'm focusing in on those that are observed later in their academic careers, later in primary school. Oh, sorry. And we see a very similar result, 7.9% point increase in attendance. Again, still statistically significant even using the wild bootstrap. Oh yeah, 1 star here is 5% significant. So these are all statistically significant. Bootstrap confidence intervals can be in the brackets. Yes, question.
So I'm wondering how likely is it during this time period to move from urban to rural area?
Yeah, so that's something that we touched on earlier. I don't get to observe people who are living in a different county, for example, than they were born, but I do get to see who is migrated across state lines.
So can you have like maybe from a different data source have a rough like idea about how likely to, or do people move between urban and rural areas during this time period? So I asked that question because if people do move because of this policy, right, from urban to rural area, then you're actually maybe 2.5 upwards.
Right, it could be a composition thing,
Yeah,
just
it could
the
be
people who value education and
Exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I don't have a good sense for how likely that is. But again, it would have to be somebody who moved from an urban to a rural area specifically in the same state. So in that sense, it's a little accounting for that, but yeah, I do see that too.
Yeah, I think just, you know, as I was saying, sort of just quickly, I just saw that from some sort of super important. Not the composition of it, which is what it is.
Yeah.
Did you expect the coefficient for part treatment? And what does that mean? Is that a typo? It's between 6 and 11? No, that's not a typo. So did you expect the coefficient to be larger for full treatment?
Yeah, I'm expecting
Partial
it,
treatment?
yeah, I'm expecting it to be larger for the full treatment. These are the people whose entire academic careers presumably is unaffected by rape. So they're able to attend public school. Whereas partial treatment, one thing it's in the appendix of the paper, what I can do is I can break this up and look at each specific age. So whether you are 7 years old and it's also considered 8 years old, 9 years old. And you get exactly the gradient that you would expect. The 7-year-olds look a lot more like the full treatment, and the 10-year-olds look a lot more like the untreated group. So hopefully, yeah, so this is exactly what I was really expecting, to get something between 0 and the full treatment coefficient for that partial treatment group.
Excuse me, I have a bit of a silly question here, I think. Have you seen anything about the permeation of like labor-saving agricultural resources or technologies? Because what I'm wondering is if I'm wondering if there's a difference between rural areas that had acquired those technologies before other ones, which might have seen them either more willing to abolish the rape bill or even sending their kids to school before. Because like, for what I recall, like the reason why they would be against, like in the New York picture you shared a few minutes ago, it would be because like it doesn't make economic sense to have your kids go when you need them on the farm in order to maintain like your livelihood.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense for how technology is really playing a role in this. I do acknowledge that things are changing at this time, like the return to education. As long as that's not differing, as long as that's orthogonal to treatment or it's happening everywhere at the same time, because I have cohort fixed effects, I'm looking at so that, but if the thinking is that these technologies are being adopted in some areas before others, then that would be a different kind of consideration. I need to think more about that. But I will note that as I mentioned in the paper, I do have there very few people are listed, very few children, I should say, are listed as working at this time. So I'm not, even though this is before the advent of child labor laws, I'm not sure how concerned I need to be about that. I hope that answered the question. I can't see.
I think so.
Okay. At least. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, these results are going to be slightly stronger for low socioeconomic status individuals. So here I have the same column as before, with 0.72, and then we can also look at specifically individuals who are lower socioeconomic status. Yes, question.
Yeah, I think to Jake's point, it would probably be interesting too to look at like number, not just family size, but look and see whether this interaction between age and like where they are in the birth order or where they are in terms of how many older younger siblings. More descriptively, I think thinking about like how parents make decisions about, you know, if you have a large family, do you just send the kids that show more aptitude, or do you just send all of the early kids until you run out of money? Like what's going on there? And you might be able to at least descriptively say something about that. If you kind of broke it down, if you have the, you know, sample sizes of it.
Yeah, luckily, in terms of raw observations, the sample size isn't so much of a concern. The big driver of these large standard errors is the wide confidence intervals, it's the number of clusters. So I'm not too concerned about, you know, restricting my sample and getting too small of a group. Yeah, that is something that I would have to need to think a lot more about. Is how growth over things. One could also kind of think that if I have 5 kids and I do want someone to work on the farm, maybe I keep two of them, whereas if I only have two kids, then we have.
Exactly, like the combination of either of her family sides would be.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something that I need to think a little bit more about. So again, in lower socioeconomic groups, we see a slightly larger effect. Note that in rural areas, the vast majority of the population is considered low SES, because farmers are categorized as an occupation score of 14. Here, I'll click on give some background on.
How do you measure SES?
Yeah, so, oh, that's wrong.
You don't have the individual families SES, do you?
So I'm not able to observe things like education and income, but they do have occupation. So what this variable occupation score does is it takes those reported occupations and gives it relative rankings by income from 1940. So this is the first census that really starts asking questions on things like educational attainment, on things like income that we would normally think are pretty important. Yeah, it's unfortunate that I can't just get an educational attainment or income, but I do think that occupation score does do a pretty good job. I'm going to consider an individual lower socioeconomic status if the maximum occupation score in their household is below 20. As I showed on the table, this is the vast majority of rural households. And in fact, in urban areas, we're going to see the vast majority would be considered high SES. Yes.
So I had a question earlier about kind of the supply effect of this, and given you have the occupational score, you could look at teacher supply in these areas and see if that's changing during this time period as a result.
Yeah, that's yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that. It's really good. And I think, as I mentioned, farmers are going to have an occupation score of 14, and that is by far the biggest group of the population in general, but especially in the rural population. And that, yes, sorry.
Among the farmers, does it make any difference what kind of a crop they grew? Because they had a cotton was the most important crop. They had a higher income. Other things are much less than that. So does it have any effect on that?
It does not ask specifically about what crop, but what you grow might impact how exactly you're categorized. So for example, farmers are coded different from ranchers, are coded different from, other agricultural jobs, but still the vast majority is farmer. Yeah, it doesn't have anything on what exactly. So it is true that we could see farmers with vastly different incomes being coded as an occupation score of 14, just because they take the average from 1940 and use that to rank the occupations.
So I think you don't have a very long panel here, right, of decennial census, so you can't do sort of the traditional event studies that we kind of think about we might like to see. But have you sort of looked just to see if the differential school attendance rate for the treatment group was different in treatment control states? It's just a year in the census just prior to adoption. I guess you need another year before that. I mean, you have some, so you have 1850, 1860, so basically be from the states that are implementing in the 1870s, which I know is or later, which is a small subset of the total number of states.
Right.
But something, or can you get some earlier data, something to show us that prior to treatment, there was, if not a trend that was similar, at least a level differential that was similar.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. One limitation that you didn't bring up is because I'm only observing people once a year, rather than getting the whole snapshot of their careers. The age at which I observe people who where treatment is switching is going to differ across states, and because these attendance profiles do change as people age. That's another thing that I would have to consider in this event study. So no, I don't have anything to show you on that specific. Yeah, and again, thinking back to the 1870s and 80s, yeah, it's a very small number of states, and that's also when you think compulsory school laws, or if they were to threaten anything, that is when they come into effect. So I've only got about 10 more minutes. As for robustness, I can exclude the 9 states in the American South and the Confederacy and some of the adjacent states. And the estimates are going to change, and the errors are of course going to change because I'm losing a third of my clusters. But the effects are remain positive to some extent. It's a very similar story. I can look at compulsory school laws in a few different ways. I can either restrict my sample to the 15 states that I know exactly when they pass these CSLs, and I can either include it on the right hand side, and that'll just be an indicator for whether or not they pass it prior to their observation, or I can drop everybody in 1880 and drop Vermont, in which case I'm only looking at 14 states that I know had not passed a compulsory school law prior to that. Results there again are going to be similar, but we're losing even more states as we go further down. Third, we have interstate mobility. This is something that's come up a couple of times. 15% of the sample is observed in a state different from where they were born. For that reason, I can drop those people, think that maybe they're migrating for some reasons that might be correlated with education, and those people wouldn't necessarily be randomly assigned treatment if you're moving somewhere because of abolishing release, for example. So I can drop those people, the estimates stay the same. And lastly, you know that there's this large recent literature on the potential problems, pitfalls with staggered adoption, with the potential for heterogeneous treatments. So I'm happy to talk about that more if people want, but there's some convincing evidence to me that this shouldn't be considered. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the economic significance. Briefly, a 7.2 percentage point increase in attendance suggests an extra, across 10 years, I should say, suggests an additional 0.72 years of average educational attainment. So everyone is, on average, 7.2 percentage points more likely to attend across this 10-year time period. I think that this 0.72 might be an underestimate for 2 reasons. First, we have this continuation value that if I'm induced to attend one more year, then maybe I spend another year after that. And things along those lines. This is especially important when we think about the high school revolution and how if you don't get people to attend until they're 13 or 14, then you know that they're not going to be completing secondary school once those come into play in the early 20th century. Second, with part-time attendance and the structure of the census, as we've talked about, especially in rural areas, there's the potential for people to be attending part-time. And they would still show up in the census as having attended school in the past year. So these people that are attending part-time before these policies and switch to full-time are not going to be counted as, or not going to be included in these estimates, right? I can only observe the extensive margin. People switching from no school to some or full school, not those people switching from some school to full school. So here I include a couple estimates for returns to education from the literature. The first of these from Esther Duflo in 2001 uses school construction in Indonesia in the 1970s in the end, estimate the returns to education. She finds this interval between a bit under 7 and 10.5%. This is the increase in earnings per additional year of education. So this is pretty high. This is pretty significant. And this is for primary school, so in that sense, it's especially relevant to the population that I'm looking at. And I'll also note, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about development. Indonesia in the 1970s, in terms of agricultural population in rural areas actually looks pretty similar to the United States in its the late 19th century, I should say. And then second, Golden and Katz, 2000, uses the Iowa 1950 agricultural census. So this is, this was one of the only data sources at this time that actually recorded someone's educational attainment. And in doing so, they're able to answer this question about how education affects farmer productivity. And they find that even within occupation, we still see these large returns to education, about 4%. And this is ignoring anybody who would have otherwise been a farmer and instead used to switch to a higher SPS occupation. Also note that this is for secondary school, so if we think that the returns are concave, we think that for primary schools, it would be higher. Okay, briefly, since I know I'm running out of time. So primary schools are very important to agriculture. Some of you probably already feel this way. But T.W. Schultz would say that the primary schools is the most profitable of all levels of schooling. Even getting people basic skills, basic math, basic reading, allows them to be much more productive farmers. And this really ties into what Golden and Katz is saying in 2000. Additionally, there's a lower opportunity cost for these early primary schools. This isn't somebody who is 16 and might otherwise be working. This isn't somebody who's 20 might otherwise be working. And just the diffusion of education really helps people adopt new technologies. So it really allows the Industrial Revolution labor-saving technologies to be better incorporated into the agricultural sector. I believe it's in the same book, but there's an example of the introduction, or not introduction, of a big irrigation project in India, and how in response to this irrigation project, agricultural productivity really does increase, but it was actually significantly less than they had initially thought because the population at the time was undereducated. As for the historical significance, as I mentioned, the United States is becoming the most educated country in the world at this time. It's not quite middle of the pack in the mid 1850s, but it's one of the leaders, and it becomes by far the leader in primary education enrollment. This is 13 percentage points higher than any other country. And then in terms of continuation value, this really sets the stage for the high school revolution, because you need people to be attending up until secondary school if you want them to start attending secondary school. So this is happening a little bit later. Yeah, question?
In terms of demonstrating the value of your finding 4.7 additional years of education, is there any articles that summarize all the other benefits of education besides the additional productivity in agriculture, such as the advantages in terms of voting, the population who's more educated can, be better voters, they can run their families more. I mean, there's all this literature on the benefits of education. Maybe you can find some of the, some summaries of all these benefits somewhere in the literature. You could even, you brought up T.W. Schultz, who employed me as a research assistant back in 1972 at the University of Chicago. So this is not totally
Not that one.
No.
so and he was at the transition in terms of bringing in home economics, the whole discipline of home economics. Margaret Reed was hired by T.W. Schultz at the University of Chicago with a joint appointment in home economics and economics. And the home economics people, they did some research on the benefits of education for home productivity. And that could be something that adds to the importance of your finding.
Yeah, that is something that I could tie in. The reason I bring up one of the big things about T.W. Schultz is when we think about like the structural change and the broader effects of reverberating through the economy. We do see, you know, a declining fraction of labor employed in agriculture in the second half of the 19th century, in the early 20th century. And there are three possible ways in which education like could reverberate through these this channel. Could induce structural change. As I mentioned, workers and more students in non-agricultural work. Agricultural workers are more productive, and there's this literature that shows when productivity in agriculture increases, that actually typically induces workers to shift out of agriculture and into more productive fields. And then there's also a literature that as we increase education, this is going to lead to increased innovation. So I'll briefly conclude right on time. We have this, in response to these racial abolition laws that are making public schools free in the second half of the 19th century, we see this 7.2% increase in attendance for the relevant populations, right? These primary age children in rural areas. This corresponds with a 0.72 additional years of average educational attainment. This is important because it sheds light on the relative impact between rate bills, which I've shown really impact attendance and compulsory school laws, which the literature is a little bit less excited about. And then this also highlights the importance of imposing these bans on these rural areas that otherwise would have continued to charge tuition, to charge user fees, but the imposition of these racial abolition laws on states, I find to be very important in inducing this increase in educational attainment and attendance. So that's the end of my talk. Just 1 minute over.
Be around if you have questions, just two more quick things. Number one, next Thursday, we have a morning, afternoon doubleheader. In an early morning, virtual seminar with Brian Kovac from Carnegie Mellon. He works in the areas of international migration and trade. He'll be giving a talk virtually. And then at our normal seminar time in person, we have Adam Shumway, who's also doing an economic history topic on the building of hospitals early in the 20th century.